Oh, where would you like me to start? Right at the very beginning? Let's see. Canadian by birth. I was born in Canada's very far north. Son of a daughter of a fur trader, and
Seriously?
seriously Canadiana, and
Wow.
and he was a. My mother was the daughter of a prospector, a gold prospector, an inventor. So I grew up pretty much. In the land of the midnight sun with hours being my own and a lot of freedom, tremendous amount of freedom. There's not much up there except for rocks, stubby trees, 100 miles south of the tree line, and just a terrific amount of exposure to the outdoors and a lot of different cultures. The Yellowknife Indians, for one. My first friends were, Native Indians, and we just grew up in a way I don't think that many kids have the chance to now or even then. So I think that gave me a certain sense of adventure.
I mean, yeah, you blow my mind. I mean, I'm just imagining the mental picture here of being out there in such a rugged. I have this mental image of what it must be like to grow up there. And so then from your childhood on, and coming from that background, tell us you went to school somewhere along the line you decided to be an architect, or did you first go into another career?
Well, my first choice was painting, painting and drawing, and so I studied and got my Bachelor of Fine Arts at the University of Alberta, which is 1,000 miles south of where I grew up.
Wow, a
And
thousand miles.
yeah, yeah, and it was a terrific time being in the big city. And then I went to Europe to see what the competition was going to be. I wanted to look at the best paintings that had ever been painted and the best sculptures that had ever been made, and was completely amazed by the architecture. Um, uh, the paintings just dwindled in comparison. The buildings I was just astounded by, and I thought, well, here's a chance to really make an impact. So returning from Europe, I joined. I wrote to the first 50 architects in the phone book, and got a call from a couple, and ended up with Bart Myers, who's quite well known actually here and in Canada. And he happened to be a professor at UCLA. He said, "This is a school for you, young lady," and so I ended up in Los Angeles for my master's in architecture, and worked very hard.
In school?
Yeah.
Tell me a little bit about your experience at UCLA in the master's program. What was that like?
It was a great time to be there, Enoch. They have, Frank Gehry was giving studios, and Tom Main, and Morphosis when they were still a company, and we had Rios Pearson, and we had Eric Owen Moss, and so many architects at the time. And this was, I graduated in 87. It was really when a lot of these people were starting to really get their legs. And I can't tell you just the excitement at the time about architecture. And so very, very lucky. And I just can't remember much else about Los Angeles except the studio, which is crazy because it's a very exciting city. And it's a city, too, that was right on the cusp of really becoming something that mattered. And very edgy place. And it was just a really great time to be there.
Fascinating. I mean, a lot of energy. I can just imagine, having these architects are on the cutting edge of LA, especially down there, around Santa Monica where they're just pushing all the bounds. How did that relate to the studio and your experience at school? What was UCLA at that time? Was it more theoretical? Was it more construction based? Did it have a particular kind of theme to the architecture program?
That's a good question, Enoch, and it's very uh, theoretical, I would say. Not so much as SciArc, which I know you've heard about, but in more of a practical, theoretical way, being encouraged to explore things that it would be very unlikely you could have the chance to do once you graduated. I would say we didn't get a lot of grounding in the actual business of architecture, which I think is something that all schools need to look a little more closely at. But we were given the opportunity to just really explore, and actually we were goaded into being more adventuresome and take more risks. As many of us went in there very conservative, wanting to do nice little projects, but we were actually kind of kicked out of that kind of attitude and said, here's your chance. And
Fascinating.
also, it is. And how many architecture schools does LA have? Like four at least. So it was quite competitive between them all, and we'd go to each other's crits. And yeah, so it was a great experience because Cal Poly has a much more practical focus, and then SciArc was much more experimental again, and then there was USC, which was probably somewhere in the middle of all that. And because of that, there was constant lectures. There probably, I know there still is, house tours of, it's got a great history of modernism in LA, mid-century modern, Neutra and Schindler, and it's a fabulous place to study architecture if you're interested in that sort of cutting-edge modern thing.
Excellent. You mentioned that at school there was not much of an emphasis or even much note about the business side of architecture. That's what a lot of us architects have found is we went to school to design. And you mentioned that you wish in a way that they would have had a little bit more of that in curriculum, or maybe there was some room to put more of that in. What things about the business of architecture do you think would be important for students coming out of school to learn?
Well, I think it's going to be important to stress that it's great to think outside of the norm. It's fabulous. One must do that, and it has to be encouraged. However, the science of building is what's going to make it happen. So I think it's important to not just stress the science of building, but also to talk about how are these things going to get funded, and what are the options in getting your projects built. At that time in particular, it was very much the STAR thing, all these wonderful architects that everyone, oh, they're so amazing. So if you weren't a STAR, it was sort of like, what's the other option? Well, you were a CAD jockey doing elevators. There wasn't really much of a emphasis given on an alternate way to do architecture other than being a STAR. So if you weren't a STAR, it was like, well, then what are you? So I think that maybe that's still being answered at the school. It's been a while, but I think it's definitely something that the STAR system was very much glorified and talked about as something that we should all aspire to. And I'm thinking maybe that's a little bit off base, particularly after we've come through these last 10 years and what we've seen.
Interesting, and that is definitely a dialogue that I hear going on social media, architects are talking about it in the journals that we hear, the architectural magazines, people are discussing the role of the star architect versus the majority of what architects do. So yourself, and where did the career take you? Did you go to try to be the star architect route? Where did you fall in that continuum?
Well, I must say that the only reason I was in Los Angeles was to go to architecture school. So weekends were dude, surf's up. And I was
Awesome.
forget about it. I'm here to work. And so I had a different attitude. So one would say that is the kind of attitude that is driven by, I really wanted to succeed. I also had to succeed because I was paying my own way. So if it wasn't for scholarships that I managed to get 3 years in a row, I probably would have had to bail and go work in a restaurant somewhere. So I was very motivated financially to actually continue to excel because that was the only thing that was keeping me in school. So I would say then I graduated with that same idea that you just work hard enough and you're going to get noticed and all these people are going to call you up and throw money at you. And, yeah, that's how I graduated. And of course, life gets real.
Yeah. So did that work out? I mean, how did that happen?
How did it work out?
Well, you'd mentioned, the idea, and I know you're being tongue-in-cheek about people throwing money at you and working hard. So what was the reality when you came out that you discovered?
The reality was $11 an hour working in an office. Can you imagine that? With huge student loans, $11 an hour, and my engineering friends were making twice that as a starting salary. Attorneys, doctors, they were like shaking their heads. It's like, what? Because I worked so hard. I worked harder than any of them put together, except, well, maybe doctors. But and then I was asking for a raise to $11.50 an hour. That's appalling. And I don't think it's changed that much. And I still think that there's a lot of soul-searching architects need to do about how hard they work during school and, after school and what the rewards are. And to me, that's always been a disconnect.
Yeah. You've been in the industry long enough to probably have gathered some conclusions or some hypotheses about the industry. And let's just speculate a little bit, just what do you think, what are your opinion of why that system is the way it is in terms of I don't know if it's a pay disparity or not, but there's definitely the impression that starting architects have a low salary, and then even when they're in the prime of their career, their salaries don't necessarily compete with the amount of time they put in school regarding compared to some other professions.
And the
So
internship.
exactly. Do you see any core systemic problems with the architecture field that kind of lend to that, or what's your perspective on why that is?
That is such a great question, and I wonder how we actually got ourselves in this position in the first place. And I'd say it probably goes back to, at one point we were master builders, and then we kind of lost that because somehow it got dirty to mess with the buildings portion of the whole idea of getting buildings built. And as a matter of fact, I think it was quite clear in the 30s and 40s in the AIA, uh, whatever they call it, set of rules that you never mixed architecture with the actual construction. And I think that kind of separated architects from their previous grand role, deservedly so, of the master builder. And since then, it's been more and more diluted, and we read the same blogs. A lot of it's architects not wanting to take responsibility because it's gotten so litigious, so they, give a lot of responsibility to contractors, project managers, none of whom have architecture as their first architecture as their first goal. So I think I have to say I'm afraid architects have to take the responsibility for where things are now because they've abrogated pretty much a lot of the scope to other parties. So I have to say architects can only look at themselves.
Gotcha. Well, it's good to get your thoughts on that, Heather. I appreciate it. Another question I had for you was, so let's go back to the time when you came out of school, you went and worked really hard at these firms for $11 an hour for a while, and then take me from there to give me a summary of your career up to the point where you went out on your own.
The summary, well, yeah, I worked for a number of bigger firms, Hardy Holtzman Pfeiffer and Barton Myers, as I said, and then also Rios Pearson, who do some lovely work in LA. And then the early 90s hit 92 when it was pretty similar to what we just went through. And so at that time, they were still building in Canada. So I had to say goodbye to LA, and I went back to Canada when, to actually continue to get my chops in how to build. And I was hired by a couple of, I call them cowboy architects, and they're called Osborne Clark Productions. They're two architects, but they gave me a tremendous amount of responsibility. It was awesome. They put me in a little float plane. This is in Vancouver, and sent me off to all these little islands to help them build houses for people who were retiring or building second or third homes on these little islands from the ground up, clearing the site, getting the materials in by ferry or truck or float plane because it's pretty rough there getting all the services brought in. And they would just put me in the float plane, wave goodbye, and say, you go, girl. And so I really was given a lot of sink or swim responsibility right from the beginning. And that's where I really learned what it's about. And talking to the builders, being comfortable with the guys. Let's face it, they're all guys. And enjoying them, having fun, at the same time as being scared to death with all the responsibility. But, that was pretty good. And what happened was I met my husband on one of these, the shortest airplane flight in Canada, 13 minutes long. And so we ended up getting married and moving to one of these little islands. And the only other architect on that island, Schubart, actually a former student of Frank Lloyd Wright, well, he died. And so there was, hi, I'm an architect and I live here. So it was very fortuitous that I started to get calls from people wanting, second homes from this little island called Salt Spring. It's one of the Gulf Islands. There's Bellingham and Thetis Island in the United States. There's a string. It's called the Gulf Islands. It's off the coast of Seattle. They extend up into Canada, and it was on one of those that I was able to actually then start to do my own projects and just seat of the pants stuff because, I hadn't really done a lot of that except for another company. So.
And how did people know that you were an architect and to call you?
Well, first of all, there's a little paper there, but it's a very small island, and it's one of those places that the population swells during the summer, and then during the winter there's just the locals. So word got out, I think, because I started to talk to some builders and say, look, if we could work together, etc. And then also people had heard of Osborne Clark. These are the people that I worked for before I decided to start my own firm on the island, and they checked me out to see if I was frankly cheaper. And I was. So let's face it, they picked me because I was cheaper. I was certainly untried. So.
And you mentioned too the architecture firm you worked for is Cowboy Architects. What did you mean by that?
Well, they didn't follow the rules. They were like, they had a first of all, they had like three women working for them, and they kind of run a kind of office where we'd kick off on a Friday, and then we'd go and sit at the sit on the water and drink beer, but then we'd come in on the weekends and work really hard till say really late. And they were not a bow tie and little round glass and white shirt and tie, white shirt firm. They were kind of the opposite. They were rugged guys hopping on float planes, tromping around this. They were coasties. You know what that means? You know what a coastie is. Yeah, well, someone who's very comfortable on the coast and is used to that kind of float plane way of getting around and sitting out around a campfire, and more of a rough and ready kind of architect than a stiff-laced, stiff office kind of guy in New York. Completely the opposite. And I loved that. It was very fun.
Well, now is a great time to talk about our success quote, Heather. Did you have the opportunity to look up a quote that you'd like to share with our audience?
Oh, yes, I did. I'll put on my specs. And
we would love to hear that.
Yeah. This is kind of perfect. It's like, hell, there are no rules here. We're trying to accomplish something. That's from Thomas Edison.
Wow, that ties in perfectly with what we were just talking about. So tell me about that. What did that mean to you, and why did you choose to pick that particular quote?
Because in the end, you have to follow, I would say, your own rules, and you have to make your own rules and basically forget about what everyone else is doing, because it'll just scare you if you start worrying too much about what everyone else and where they are and how they function. And it takes a lot of, I would say, fortitude and self-belief to forge ahead on a path that maybe no one else has ever fallen before. But I think that's it. Forget about the rules.
Well, we know that Thomas Edison was a great innovator. So could you just give us that quote one more time so we could hear it again?
Hell, there are no rules here. We've got a project to build.
Nice. Have you ever used that on site?
Yeah, and it mostly gives a laugh. And it kind of lightens things up a little bit, too.
Yeah.
It's good. It's like, don't take it so seriously. We're just doing stuff here, and
Absolutely, lighten up the mood a little bit. Now, on the island, when you started working for yourself and providing architectural services, give me one or two lessons that you learned from that early time, maybe things that you hadn't realized before or things that help you be successful in the future.
I'd say the most important thing I learned, Enoch, was working with the people who are building the project. I have such huge respect for everything they do. They work so hard, and there's nothing more wonderful to me than a beautiful detail of, say, how you keep the water out, or how you put a horizontal up against a vertical in a beautiful way. And the respect I have for these craftspeople who actually do this all the way through to the, the guys who are doing the blasting. It's, to me, I just have a huge amount of respect for the people who are actually doing the building. And so I would say my biggest lesson is that you show them that kind of respect and you'll get it back in spades. They'll work for you. They'll work overtime. They'll, I'm not saying being their friend, but there's a certain respect that's established simply from, first of all, you have to have good craftspeople to be able to give them that. But that's the important lesson.
Here on the show, we're all about learning from our past mistakes and failures. Is there a failure that you can look at that you had that you were able to overcome and then learn from that failure that you can share with us?
Yeah, I would say perhaps in this house that we just finished, somehow thinking that, well, we're paying them and we've signed a contract and therefore they're going to perform. I think the biggest mistake I've made is thinking that maybe I don't have to pay as close attention to something as I really do need to. Expecting people to always perform, and I think the biggest mistake was just not paying close enough attention. And I learned that you got to be there every day, and you've got to know it better than them, because in the end, you're the one paying the bills, and you're the one taking responsibility, and no one cares like you do. That's the biggest lesson I've learned.
So you were up in Canada, and then somehow you ended up back down in Southern California. Was there an intermediate place, or how did you end up back in La Jolla?
Well, to be honest, Enoch, it rains up there.
Tell me about it. That's what I hear.
I know. It starts raining in October and it lets up maybe in end of March, and it's so depressing, especially if you used to live in LA. So I pined, and I finally dragged my husband back. And yeah, I don't know if you can ever return to a place you left. So I don't know if I wanted to do LA again. So we checked out San Diego. It's a little more relaxed here. I felt there's a little bit more room. It's so competitive in LA, which is great, but there's just a different pace here. So I dragged my husband back here, and we found a place in La Jolla. It was the least expensive house, independent place, and it was by Rudolf Schindler, little place called, what are they called? The Pueblos. I don't know if you know them from the history books, but they're one of Schindler's first, kind of like a condominium project of concrete slip pour construction, and we bought one of those for 300 and some thousand here in La Jolla. We couldn't believe we could afford to live here. So this, by the way, I didn't mention that this entire space was 600 and some square feet.
Wow.
So it was interesting. My husband had his office there, and after a while I had my office there, and it's interesting. So,
interesting. That is interesting. So you mentioned your husband had his office there. I'm sure our listeners are curious. Tell us a little bit about your husband. What does he do?
oh, my husband's an engineer. We're completely unaffiliated in terms of business, and he's basically he works with the big oil companies on ice spills, oil spills and oil and ice shipping, oil spill plans, how to clean up oil. And so he spends a lot of time in the computer and mostly traveling. He just got back from Kazakhstan. They're working on ways to do ice cleanup, and yeah, he's got a pretty neat job, and it's fun. But I'm the boss of the architecture.
Nice. So he's not tied to location with his job, it sounds. Is he flexible with his location, or is he tied to an office?
Yeah, absolutely. So we can live anywhere, except I'm a little bit more tied down to where building happens to be going on.
Yeah, okay. Now, since you had already gotten your start up there in Canada, you come down to La Jolla, and you're looking at starting up your architectural practice. What were your immediate steps to try to find work?
Enoch, how many times have you heard this? Tell me.
I'm
just looking into my little camera, but how many times have you heard this? I started doing decks and bathroom remodels, and I have to be frank. I think that I'm, like anybody, easy enough to talk to and charming enough. Most architects are, right? We're so charismatic. But people chose me because I think I was reasonably priced, and I wasn't scary. I wasn't some big fancy architect who had been in all the magazines, and they basically just wanted a deck. They didn't want a star architect. They wanted someone just to get something done. So I don't think anything's changed. I think if architects are still, losing out to other people, it's going to be the people who are draftspeople and people who aren't intimidating. And I think that gets a lot of little jobs done, and they're by people who have nothing to do with architecture or the name architect. Mind you, I was licensed.
Very interesting insight. I mean, I know that I'm doing some of those projects right now myself.
Yeah.
And how did you get your name out there?
My neighbor gave me my first one, and that deck turned into a whole second story and remodel. And what else can I say? Always being sort of competitive enough, I guess. I wanted to make sure it was photographed right. And I sent it to some magazines, and they sort of took a little bit of interest. And so I got that one project published, and then once again, just hanging around furniture stores that are, selling interesting furniture, and then you get to know the people, and then you get invited to their parties, and make good friends with certain people who then have other people coming into their store who may be looking for architects. And that's how I got my next big job, which was a ground up after a fire. And that really helped too, because it turned out their neighbor I had met at this particular modern furniture store, and we talked, and it's just very fortuitous. And it was never super easy. There's piles of stuff that I just, they never called me back. So,
Yeah. Yeah. So you got to explain that a little bit more to me, because right now, hanging around a furniture store, I'm seeing you standing by the doorway, kind of hiding
It's
behind a sofa, waiting for the next person to come in the store. How does that work?
Well, actually, we after this little Schindler house, we were squished, and it became apparent we had to find something really great to move into, because being architecture fans, we found a place out in Escondido, which is quite a ways inland, and but it was built by Homer Delowy, who is a local architect now. He's not around anymore. He died, but he was a really good mid-century modern guy, and we totally loved this house, and it was way out in the boonies. So we moved out there, and then to furnish this wonderful mid-century modern house, we went to this store called Boomerang for Modern, and he had all the great stuff, and by the name you can tell what kind of great stuff. And his name's David Skelly, great guy, and he has and did have soirees when he invite all the modern fans to everyone's different house, and so we had an evening at that house, the house that we had, and that's how we got to know other like-minded people. So that kind of helped a lot, and particularly for San Diego, which isn't known as a hotbed of modern architecture. It's a very small group, so we got to know each other pretty well.
Interesting. And how keen is your husband on the modern architecture?
Oh, he loves it. I met him and he had an egg chair. So,
Ooh.
So I know I got to keep this guy.
An engineer with an egg chair. That sounds interesting.
Yeah.
We need to have him on the show sometime. He sounds like an interesting guy.
He's right there.
Oh, is he? Oh, okay. Tell him I said hi. So now you're here and you start going from decks, and you're very methodical about how you document your project and how you try to get it published. What are the things that you seem to be successful for getting the kind of projects that you want to work on? It sounds like dialing in with that modern group was very instrumental.
Yeah, it definitely was, Enoch, and I would say what's been instrumental in getting any project I've ever won is my enthusiasm and passion. I think it's catchy. And I'm not sure how other architects talk, but from what I've heard from the clients that do hire me, it's they talk about square footage and dollars per square foot, and I don't talk about that. I talk about how the light comes in and how you move through the place and where to put your keys when you come in, and I love architecture. Yeah, I think that probably communicates itself. And naturally, I think it probably makes enough people go, no, she's not the right person. We just need some plans.
And that's a wrap for another show about the business of architecture. To get more resources about how you as an architect can raise your fees, land the projects you love to work on, and get the time in your day back, join the members-only Business of Architecture Insider List for free by going to businessofarchitecture.com/free. Enter your best email address there, and I will send you instant access to free resources, including my book, Social Media for Architects. If you'd like to discuss a thought or insight from today's show, visit businessofarchitecture.com/podcast. On that page, you'll also find my notes from today's show and the action items I took away from our conversation. Until next week, keep rocking and go conquer the world.
Everybody knows that you just gotta do it anyway.
The views expressed on this show by my guests do not represent those of the host, and I make no representation, promise, guarantee, pledge, warranty, contract, bond, or commitment except to help architects conquer the world. Bump music credit to Ben Folds 5. Do it anyway.